A luxurious yacht filled with the laughter and arrogance of its wealthy passengers turned into a trap when pirate boats appeared on the horizon. Panic gripped the guests, and then everything depended on the captain, whom they had despised until recently. His actions changed everything and shocked absolutely everyone. Subscribe to the channel, write in the comments which city you are from, and share this video with your friends. The midday sun scattered shards of gold across the glittering surface of the Mediterranean, where the immense yacht cut through the calm waters like a moving palace. From a distance, its silhouette looked less like a vessel and more like a floating estate, a monument to wealth drifting across a boundless blue canvas. The white hull gleamed, so bright it nearly blinded the eyes, polished until it shone like ivory under the ruthless light. On the upper decks, the chrome and brass fixtures caught the rays of the sun and sent them flashing like jewels. The vessel itself was a spectacle designed to impress, to remind anyone who saw it that it belonged to those for whom life had always bent and bowed in servitude. Inside, the yacht was even more overwhelming. Floors of Italian marble stretched from corridor to corridor, cool beneath designer shoes. Chandeliers of cut glass sparkled overhead, each one an unnecessary excess in a place already drowning in luxury. Hand-woven Persian rugs muffled footsteps in lounges where Italian leather furniture stood untouched, more for display than use. Every surface seemed calculated to remind its passengers of their superiority. Gilt frames around oil paintings, crystal glasses filled with champagne so cold that beads of condensation slid endlessly down their sides. The air smelled faintly of citrus polish and expensive perfume, a combination of sea air tamed and domesticated for the wealthy who despised the rawness of the ocean but demanded its views. The owners of this marvel had gathered their chosen circle. Ethan, the man whose money had made the yacht possible, moved among his guests with the smugness of someone convinced that fortune itself had anointed him. His voice carried above the others, not because it was loud, but because it demanded attention. When he spoke, the people around him fell silent, their laughter pausing midstream as though afraid to miss a phrase that could later be repeated as an anecdote in a higher circle. He was a man accustomed to obedience, to the nodding of heads, to the flattery that flowed toward him as naturally as the tide. His wife, Clara, was his counterpart in every sense. Clad in silk that shimmered like liquid pearl, she thrived in the role of hostess, guiding conversations with light touches on arms and laughter that carried no warmth but abundant charm. To her, the yacht was a stage, and every guest an actor who must play their role in her performance of superiority. Their companions matched them in arrogance, each one a polished example of self-importance. A banker spoke endlessly of mergers and acquisitions, his hands constantly caressing his glass of wine as though wealth itself flowed from the stem. A young influencer, dressed in the latest fashion, posed against the polished railings, capturing the sea and her own reflection in endless photographs. Another guest, a politician accompanied by his family, made veiled references to power and influence, reminding everyone at the table of his connections. Their laughter filled the air, hollow and brittle, bouncing off marble and brass, reinforcing the illusion that they belonged to a world higher than ordinary mortals. Moving among them, unnoticed except when mocked, was the captain of the vessel. Richard was a man whose skin bore the dark bronze of years under merciless suns, whose eyes carried the knowledge of tempests, ice, and distance. His hands were strong, scarred by rope and salt, yet steady as he adjusted the wheel or checked the instruments. He had once commanded ships across oceans, had charted courses through storms where lesser men would have faltered, had led crews through perilous rescues in seas colder than death itself. Those stories, carved deep into his memory, needed no retelling. He carried them in his posture, in the calm way he stood at the bridge, in the unshakable certainty of his gaze upon the horizon. But to the passengers, he was merely an employee, a man hired to serve, not to command respect. Their glances toward him were tinged with dismissal, their comments laced with mockery. One whispered loudly enough for him to hear that he spoke like a fisherman pretending to be a captain. Another laughed at the way his uniform seemed too simple, suggesting he did not understand the meaning of elegance. When Richard passed near, conversations sometimes paused, and smirks flickered among faces polished with arrogance. He had been insulted more times in an hour than he had in months at sea, yet he betrayed no reaction. His face was carved from discipline, his silence a shield forged by years of enduring worse than words. The crew, however, knew him differently. To them he was not just a superior, but a leader who commanded without shouting, who inspired loyalty without demanding it. They followed his instructions with the ease of habit, trusting him more than they trusted the wealthy owners who had paid for their labor. In whispered exchanges in the galley or quick nods on deck, they acknowledged his quiet authority, drawing strength from the calmness that never seemed to leave him. Where the passengers saw only a servant, the crew recognized a captain whose steadiness had saved lives. Even so, the contrast between the two worlds on the yacht grew sharper with every passing moment. The guests toasted to themselves, drinking to fortunes and victories, laughing at stories that celebrated their wealth. Meanwhile, Richard stood on the bridge, his gaze fixed on the instruments, his mind tuned to the sea. The wind shifted slightly, carrying with it a scent of brine and freedom that the polished perfumes inside could not suppress. He thought of the ocean as it truly was, vast, impartial, relentless. Out here, status meant nothing. The sea did not care for diamonds or titles, nor for marble or crystal. It cared only for skill, for respect, for endurance. And Richard, though mocked and dismissed, knew he belonged to that truth. As the evening deepened, music drifted from the deck where the guests had gathered to dance. Their movements were clumsy but confident, each step a display rather than a rhythm. Clara's laughter rang out like a bell, drawing eyes to her as she swayed against the glowing sunset. Ethan lifted his glass, proclaiming that no voyage could rival this one, that their yacht was the crown jewel of the Mediterranean. The guests cheered, blinded by champagne and the glow of self-importance. Richard remained at his post, silent, his expression unreadable. In his heart, however, a quiet storm gathered. He had seen too many voyages where arrogance blinded men to danger. He knew the sea never allowed itself to be conquered. It tolerated the proud only long enough to remind them of their fragility. Tonight, as the yacht pressed forward across the calm water, the captain could not shake the sense that this arrogance would soon be tested. The guests believed themselves untouchable, but he had lived long enough to understand that the ocean always demanded humility in the end. And so, while laughter echoed across the marble halls, Richard's steady hands gripped the wheel, his eyes searching the horizon for what lay ahead. He felt no need to answer the contempt of those he served. The sea would answer for him in time. The day stretched on in golden silence, the Mediterranean lying smooth as glass beneath the drifting yacht. The sun had begun its slow descent, drawing out the shadows across the polished decks and painting the horizon in colors that seemed almost too rich to be real. For the passengers, the world remained nothing more than a stage set for their indulgence. They sat with crystal glasses in hand, their laughter rising and falling in waves that seemed louder than the sea itself. The clink of silver cutlery echoed faintly from the dining room, where a late meal had been laid out with meticulous care. Music spilled faintly across the upper decks, and the rhythm of the yacht against the water became nothing more than a background murmur to the endless parade of stories about wealth, success, and privilege. Richard remained on the bridge as he always did. The crew moved with quiet efficiency under his command, attending to tasks both large and small, ensuring that nothing disturbed the elegance demanded by their employers. Yet as the laughter floated up from below, Richard's gaze remained fixed on the horizon. His eyes, sharpened by years of reading distant waters, had caught something unusual. 3 small dots, faint against the expanse of sea. They appeared insignificant at first glance, easily dismissed as fishing boats or private vessels enjoying the late afternoon calm. But to a man like Richard, whose life had been bound to the sea and its moods, they did not sit right. Their movement was too steady, too directed, too intentional. He reached for the binoculars and lifted them, the polished brass glinting briefly in the light. Through the lenses, the dots became sharper. Small motorboats, their bows cutting through the waves with speed that seemed unnecessary for fishing. His expression tightened, though he did not allow his body to betray alarm. He lowered the binoculars slowly, his fingers tapping lightly against the rail, and turned his attention back to the instruments before him. His calm was unbroken, but deep within, a familiar unease stirred. The sea had taught him to trust instincts sharpened by decades. Something about the sight made him wary. On the deck below, the guests remained oblivious. The banker argued heatedly with the politician about the value of offshore holdings, their voices overlapping as though volume alone could prove superiority. Clara leaned on the railing, her laughter cascading like bells, as she told a story about a Parisian gala. The influencer posed with the sunset behind her, angling her phone to catch both her own face and the golden horizon in the same frame. Ethan raised his glass once more, proclaiming that this was the pinnacle of life, that no other vessel, no other voyage, no other experience could match what they were enjoying. The others cheered with the hollow enthusiasm of those who had nothing left to cheer for except themselves. When Richard's shadow fell briefly across their gathering, Ethan glanced up, smirk tugging at his lips. "Still standing guard like a soldier?" he called, his tone dripping with condescension. "Don't worry, Captain. The only danger here is the champagne running out." His companions laughed, some too loudly, eager to please. Richard gave a single nod, offering neither smile nor retort, and moved on. He would not waste words on men who believed the world bent to their will. Back on the bridge, he quietly called one of his officers closer. His voice was low, measured, a murmur meant only for trained ears. "Check the communications. Make sure all frequencies are clear and that we have direct access to the coast if needed." The officer, catching the weight of those words, nodded without question and moved quickly to obey. Richard himself adjusted the course slightly, not enough to draw attention from the passengers, but enough to give the yacht a little more distance from the approaching vessels. The dots on the horizon grew larger. Their speed became undeniable now. Richard lifted the binoculars once more, studying the wakes that stretched white behind the boats. The way they cut across the water left little room for doubt. These were no leisure craft drifting lazily through the evening. They pursued a direct line toward the yacht, accelerating with every minute. He felt the sea tighten around him, as though the waters themselves had begun to hold their breath. The guests, however, noticed nothing. Inside the main salon, the atmosphere had grown louder, rowdier. The wine had loosened tongues, and laughter spilled like broken glass across the room. Someone called for music to be turned up, and a young attendant rushed to obey. Clara swayed to the rhythm, her silk dress whispering as she moved, and Ethan watched her with possessive pride before turning back to his companions. "This," he said, sweeping his arm to indicate the shining interior, "is what life is meant to be. Not struggle, not storms, not effort. Just this. The sea is ours tonight." Richard heard those words faintly carried up through the open hatch. He allowed himself a quiet, grim smile that held no mirth. The sea belonged to no man. He had seen proud vessels split in two under the weight of storms, had watched captains beg mercy from the waves that gave none. The ocean did not bend, did not forgive. It simply waited, eternal and patient, for arrogance to falter. The motorboats were close enough now that even untrained eyes might soon notice. The setting sun cast long shadows across their wakes, and the sound of engines drifted faintly on the breeze, though it was still muffled by distance. Richard knew it was only a matter of time before the guests realized what approached. He considered briefly whether to sound the alarm now, to shatter the illusion of peace, but instinct told him to wait. Panic would spread like fire among those who believed themselves immune to fear. Better to prepare quietly, to let the crew act before chaos descended. He gave further orders in the same calm, deliberate tone. "Secure the lower decks. Make sure all access points are ready to be locked if needed, and tell the engineers to check the engines quietly." His officers dispersed like shadows, moving with practiced discipline. They had served with him long enough to understand. Richard's caution was never wasted. If he prepared, it was because danger was near. The sea darkened as the sun dipped lower. The boats grew closer still, their outlines clearer with every passing moment. From where he stood, Richard could almost see the figures aboard, dark shapes against the pale foam of their wakes. His jaw set, his mind already beginning to chart possibilities, tactics, and traps. The crew would be ready, but the passengers? How could they be? Below, the laughter had not faltered. The influencer called out that the sunset was perfect, urging everyone to gather for a photograph. Clara adjusted her hair. Ethan tightened his tie. The banker raised his glass. They posed with the sea behind them, oblivious to what approached from that same horizon. The engine's hum grew louder, faint but insistent, like the beating of a drum no one wanted to hear. Richard tightened his grip on the railing and turned his eyes once more to the horizon. He had been right. The sea had begun its test, and soon those who mocked him would learn how little their wealth could shield them. The laughter below might still echo, but already the first shadows of threat were crawling across the water, closing in on the Orlux. The golden haze of sunset hung low over the Mediterranean when the peace of the voyage broke apart. The first hint came as a rising hum that threaded itself through the air, faint at first but persistent, like a warning hidden within the sound of the sea. Richard had heard it minutes before anyone else. His ears, attuned by decades of experience, could distinguish the difference between the natural sigh of waves and the mechanical growl of engines straining with speed. Now it was no longer faint. It pressed forward in waves of sound that carried unease across the decks. The passengers noticed only when the motorboats emerged from behind the reflection of the sun, their silhouettes sharp and undeniable. At first, there was no comprehension. Clara, still laughing at some story, lifted her glass higher and pointed at the approaching vessels. "Perhaps we'll have visitors," she said, her voice bright, unaware of what her words truly meant. The influencer reached immediately for her phone, delighted at the prospect of filming the oncoming craft, certain that they were nothing more than curious locals or admirers of the yacht's grandeur. Ethan, raising an eyebrow, muttered something about fishermen daring to come too close, his tone mocking rather than alarmed. But the look in Richard's eyes, steady and grave as he turned from the bridge, should have been enough to freeze their laughter. The engines grew louder, a discordant rumble that rolled across the water until it was impossible to ignore. The three motorboats cut through the waves at a nerving speed, their bows lifting as they slammed against the swells. They moved in a formation too precise to be casual, too aggressive to be harmless. Richard watched them with a calm that concealed the storm in his mind. He had seen this before, though never on a yacht such as this. Never with passengers so incapable of understanding the danger until it was upon them. The first cries of alarm came from the crew. Trained eyes recognized the threat immediately. Young sailors hurried across the deck, securing ropes, pulling shut access hatches, preparing as discreetly as they could. Richard's voice carried over them, even firm, measured. "Lower the shutters on the main deck windows. Get the passengers inside. Lock every interior door once they are secured." His words were not shouted in panic. They were commands carved from discipline, clear enough to leave no room for doubt. The crew obeyed instantly, but the passengers resisted. Clara protested as an officer urged her toward the stairwell, her eyes flashing indignantly. "Why should I hide? This is ridiculous. They'll leave us alone once they see who we are." Ethan, puffing with arrogance, ordered the crewman to step aside, insisting that he would speak directly to the newcomers. He still believed money solved every problem, that danger was nothing more than inconvenience. The others wavered between curiosity and fear, some peering through the railings to watch the boats approach, others wringing their hands with nervous laughter that betrayed the first cracks in their confidence. Richard appeared among them then, his tall figure cutting through the gathering panic. His voice, low but undeniable, silenced the protests. "Inside, now. Lock yourselves in your cabins and wait." Something in his tone left no room for argument. Even Clara faltered, though she tossed her head in indignation as she obeyed. Ethan muttered about overreaction, but Richard did not pause to argue. He turned back toward the bridge, his steps long and purposeful. The motorboats drew alongside the yacht, engines roaring. The sea between them boiled with churned foam, the sound rattling the polished windows and shaking the illusion of safety the passengers had clung to. Then the first hook sailed through the air, its iron claw clattering against the railing with a harsh metallic bite. Rope followed, thick and coarse, pulled taut as figures began to climb. The pirates came swiftly, dark shapes leaping from their vessels with movements honed by practice. Their boots thudded onto the decks, their hands clutching weapons that gleamed cold in the fading light. The shock that rippled through the yacht was immediate. Passengers screamed, scattering in terror toward the interior. The influencer's phone clattered to the ground, forgotten in her rush to escape. Ethan shouted for the crew to protect them, his earlier arrogance stripped away by the sight of real violence. Clara's voice rose high and shrill, calling for help as she fled down the marble stairwell. Panic spread like fire through the grand salons, transforming the gilded halls into a maze of fear. Richard stood firm, his hands moved with certainty as he issued orders into the intercom. Engines to full evasive, cut power to external lights, secure the helm. He turned to his first officer. Keep them out of the command deck. This ship stays ours. His crew responded with quick practiced movements, slamming shut reinforced doors, turning corridors into barriers, setting up whatever makeshift defenses they could muster. The calm precision of their actions contrasted sharply with the chaos of the passengers, whose screams echoed through the interior. The first pirates clashed with crewmen on the deck, their weapons raised. One sailor swung a length of rope with brutal force, knocking a gun from an attacker's hands. Another used a fire extinguisher, the blast of white foam disorienting the intruder long enough to drag him to the ground. Yet for every pirate slowed, two more leapt aboard, their boots hammering against the deck as they spread in search of valuables and control. Their voices barked harsh commands, a guttural language of authority and violence that reverberated against the steel walls of the yacht. Inside, the guests crumbled. Clara collapsed against the door of her cabin, shaking as she fumbled with the lock. Ethan, his face pale, cursed at the crew for not stopping the attack, though he did nothing to help himself or anyone else. The banker wept openly, clutching his briefcase as though it were a shield, while the politicians shouted empty threats about consequences, his words carrying no weight in the face of armed men. The influencer sat trembling on the floor of the corridor, her earlier bravado reduced to silent tears. On the upper deck, Richard fought to keep order. His voice carried above the din, steady and unyielding. He directed men to seal stairwells, to hold positions, to delay the intruders at every turn. He knew the yacht was not built for battle, but he also knew that discipline and preparation could mean the difference between survival and slaughter. His mind raced with calculations, how long they could hold, what angles the pirates might exploit, whether help could be summoned in time. A pirate burst through the doorway to the bridge, his weapon raised, but Richard was already there. With a swift motion, he slammed the heavy steel door against the man, sending him staggering back. Another crewman pounced, disarming the intruder before he could recover. Richard pressed his hand against the intercom again. Stay calm, stay hidden. Do not open your door, he instructed the passengers, his voice cutting through their fear like a lifeline. The clash intensified. Grappling hooks clattered against the rails, ropes tightened, and more pirates poured aboard. Smoke filled the air as a flare gun misfired, casting a ghostly red glow across the chaos. The once serene vessel now echoed with the sounds of shouting, struggling, the crash of overturned furniture, and the shatter of glass. The grand salons that had only hours before hosted laughter and champagne were transformed into battlegrounds, their luxury trampled underfoot. Through it all, Richard remained a pillar. His calm steadied the crew, his authority cutting through confusion. He moved quickly from one point to another, his mind balancing the safety of his passengers with the need to defend the ship. Each moment carried weight, every decision shaping the fate of those aboard. He could feel the storm tightening, danger closing in on all sides, yet he never faltered. And even as the pirates forced their way deeper into the yacht, Richard's gaze remained fixed, not on the chaos around him, but on the horizon of possibilities. He knew this was only the beginning. The battle for the Orlux had just begun, and the night ahead would demand everything he had left to give. The once immaculate yacht had become a cacophony of chaos. The polished floors were slick with spilled champagne and shattered glass. Chandeliers swung with every thud of boots against the deck, and the air was thick with smoke, fear, and the sharp tang of adrenaline. The intruders had forced their way into the vessel with a ferocity that left no doubt of their intentions. They were not here as wanderers or fishermen. They were predators, and the Orlux had become their prey. Richard stood at the center of it all, his mind working faster than the chaos could unfold. Where others saw only panic, he saw pathways, possibilities, weaknesses in both friend and foe. He had spent his life on the sea where storms offered no mercy and mistakes cost lives. This moment was nothing less than another storm, one with human faces and sharpened steel. His crew looked to him instinctively, their movements gathering purpose under his calm, commanding presence. The pirates had spread quickly, their boots pounding against marble and wood, their voices barking orders to one another in guttural bursts. They carried rifles and pistols, weapons that glimmered threateningly under the swinging lights. The passengers had long since scattered into their cabins, their screams muffled behind locked doors, leaving the halls eerily empty except for those who fought. Every echo of gunmetal against railing was a reminder of what was at stake. Richard knew they could not win by brute force. The yacht was not a warship. Its strength was in its design, in the labyrinth of corridors and compartments that could be used to confuse and divide. He called his officers close in hurried whispers, his voice steady even in the midst of clamor. We cannot fight them head on. We hold them in sections, draw them into the wrong passages, use the yacht itself to slow them. Close the aft stairwell, seal off the dining hall, lead them where I say. His men nodded sharply, dispersing like shadows into the haze. The first trap was sprung almost immediately. Two pirates stormed into a gleaming corridor that ended abruptly at the locked doors of the lower galley. Believing treasure might be hidden there, they advanced recklessly. With a signal, a hidden rope was pulled, releasing a cascade of heavy galley carts that clattered down the narrow space. The men were knocked from their feet, their weapons skittering across the tiles. Within moments, crew members pounced, binding their hands with strips of canvas torn from linen cloths. The entire ambush had taken less than 30 seconds, and already Richard was turning to the next move. Elsewhere, pirates chased shadows. Crewmen darted silently through passageways, leading their pursuers into dead ends or storage rooms where nets and tarps were ready to fall from the ceiling. The yacht's luxury now became its camouflage. Hidden compartments behind wood panels, narrow service corridors that passengers never saw, and heavy doors built to withstand storms now became barriers that isolated groups of attackers from one another. The intruders, though fierce and numerous, were not accustomed to the winding opulence of such a vessel. Their shouts grew angrier, less coordinated, as confusion took root. Still, the danger was far from over. Some pirates fought with brutal strength, forcing their way into lounges and smashing through barricades. A young crewman was struck hard across the face with the butt of a rifle, collapsing with blood running freely down his cheek. Richard himself hauled the boy back to safety, his grip firm and reassuring, even as his own jaw clenched with anger. He pressed the lad's shoulder. "Stay low. You've done your part." There was no time for more. Already the clash echoed around them. The passengers remained paralyzed in their cabins, unaware of the intricacies of the defense being woven for them. In one suite, Clara clutched a pearl necklace so tightly that her knuckles were white, listening to the muffled sounds of violence beyond her door. In another, Ethan slammed his fist against the wall, cursing both pirates and crew in his blind frustration, unable to accept that he had no power in this world of blood and steel. Their wealth meant nothing here. It was the sailors, mocked and ignored only hours before, who stood between them and ruin. It was then that Richard finally caught sight of the man leading the assault. He was taller than most of his companions, broad-shouldered, his face carved into a permanent scowl. His eyes were dark and calculating, scanning the surroundings with a predator's focus. Unlike his men, he moved without wasted energy, each step deliberate, each glance precise. He carried no weapon in his hand at first, as though his very presence was enough to command obedience. Richard knew immediately that this was the leader. Here was the mind behind the attack, the core of the threat. Their eyes met across the chaos of the salon, and in that instant both men understood the other. The pirate leader saw a captain who would not yield, whose calm was as dangerous as any blade. Richard saw a foe who commanded not only with cruelty, but with intelligence. The clash between them was inevitable, and it would decide more than just the control of the yacht. It would decide the survival of everyone aboard. Richard feigned retreat, signaling two of his men to follow. They ducked into a corridor, footsteps echoing, drawing the leader and a handful of his men into pursuit. The corridor twisted twice before ending at a heavy service hatch. As the pirates pressed forward, Richard gave a subtle nod. From above, a weighted net dropped suddenly, entangling two of the attackers and pulling them to the ground with a crash. The others stumbled back, startled, and Richard moved swiftly, seizing a length of pipe from the wall. With precise force, he struck the weapon from one pirate's hands, then drove his shoulder into the man's chest, sending him sprawling. The leader, however, did not falter. With a guttural growl, he advanced, drawing a knife from his belt. His movements were sharp, practiced, the blade flashing in the dim light. Richard sidestepped the first thrust, the knife grazing the wall. The second lunge came faster, forcing him back a step, his heart pounding, but his expression unchanging. He had no weapon but the pipe, yet his grip on it was firm, his stance solid. Around them the battle raged in fragments, but here, in this narrow corridor, the struggle between captain and pirate became the center of everything. The clash was not one of brute force alone, but of will. The pirate drove forward with relentless aggression, each strike of his blade meant to end the fight quickly. Richard countered not with speed, but with precision, deflecting, dodging, using the narrowness of the space to his advantage. He remembered storms that had tossed ships like toys, remembered icy winds that cut deeper than any knife, remembered the faces of men who had trusted him to bring them through alive. That memory was his anchor now. He could not fall. Too many lives depended on him. A sudden motion gave him the chance he needed. The pirate lunged again, overreaching. Richard twisted, bringing the pipe upward in a brutal arc that caught the man's wrist. The knife clattered to the floor, spinning across the tiles. With his free hand, Richard shoved hard against the man's chest, slamming him back into the wall. The leader snarled, eyes blazing with fury, but for the first time there was doubt in them. Before the fight could finish, shouts erupted from the far end of the corridor. More pirates were coming, drawn by the struggle. Richard knew he could not win here, not against numbers. He stepped back, signaling his men to retreat further into the maze of the yacht. "Now," he hissed, and they obeyed without question. The leader, regaining his footing, roared after them, but his voice was drowned out by the confusion of his scattered men. As Richard retreated to the command deck, the plan unfolded exactly as he had envisioned. Pirates, divided and disoriented, stumbled into locked compartments or dead ends. Some were captured, bound with ropes, others isolated and forced to retreat. Still, the danger remained. The leader was not a man easily broken, and Richard knew the confrontation between them was far from finished. Back on the bridge, he steadied himself against the console, breathing deep, his heart pounding with the weight of command. Outside, the once calm sea now seemed darker, the last light of day sinking beneath the horizon. The yacht groaned under the weight of the assault, but it still floated, still held strong, and so did Richard. He looked to his men, their faces streaked with sweat and fear, but alive with determination. "We've held them this long," he said, his voice even, his eyes scanning each of them in turn. "We will hold them longer. The ship is ours, not theirs." And as the night gathered over the Aura Lux, the stage was set for the final reckoning. The night had deepened, swallowing the last traces of the sunset that had once gilded the sea in splendor. Now the Aura Lux drifted under a sky heavy with stars, the air trembling with the aftermath of conflict. The yacht was scarred, shattered glass crunched underfoot. Furniture lay overturned in what had once been pristine lounges, and scorch marks from flare guns and weapons marred the polished surfaces. The luxury that had so dazzled its passengers earlier in the day was now a twisted reminder of how fragile opulence truly was when violence intruded. Yet amidst the wreckage, the vessel still stood, her hull intact, her engines silent but ready, her spirit unbroken. Richard leaned against the console on the bridge, his breath measured, his heart steadying itself after the hours of strain. Around him, his crew worked tirelessly, securing captured pirates, tending to the wounded, and ensuring no section of the yacht remained under enemy control. They were exhausted, but their faces bore the grim satisfaction of men who had stood against a storm and refused to yield. Their loyalty to him was unspoken, yet visible in every nod, every glance. He had led them through chaos, and they knew it. The pirate leader had been dragged away in chains of thick rope, his furious eyes still gleaming with unspent rage. Even defeated, his presence carried weight. He had snarled threats as he was bound, his voice coarse with venom, but Richard had only looked at him with calm indifference. Words meant little now. The leader had gambled on breaking the Oralux and had lost. Below decks, the wealthy passengers began to emerge from their cabins, pale and shaken. Their arrogance had dissolved into fragility, their voices hushed, their steps hesitant as they ventured out to witness the aftermath. Clara clutched her shawl tightly around her shoulders, her hair disheveled, her eyes wide as they took in the devastation of the yacht's salons. Ethan followed, his face drawn, no trace of his earlier bravado remaining. His tie hung loose, his hands trembled faintly, though he tried to conceal it. The others drifted behind them, the banker with his briefcase clutched like a talisman, the influencer without her phone, the politician with hollow eyes that betrayed the collapse of his confident facade. They found Richard on the bridge, his tall figure illuminated by the faint glow of the control panels. For a long moment they said nothing, as though the weight of the silence pressed too heavily on their tongues. At last Ethan cleared his throat, the sound rough and uncertain. You saved us," he said, his voice faltering on words he was unaccustomed to using. He tried to muster dignity, but gratitude softened the edges of his tone. Clara, standing beside him, lowered her gaze. Her earlier disdain burned away by the fire of fear and survival. She whispered, "We owe you everything." Richard inclined his head slightly, his expression unchanged. "I did what was required," he replied simply. His voice carried no pride, no anger, no judgment, only the calm assurance of a man who had done his duty as he always had, with discipline and resolve. The passengers shifted uncomfortably. Their shame was palpable, their earlier scorn echoing in their minds now that they stood before the man they had mocked, alive only because of his strength. They could not meet his eyes for long. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant sound of waves lapping against the hull. From the bridge windows, Richard saw what he had been waiting for. On the horizon, a faint shimmer of light grew steadily brighter, cutting across the darkness. The rhythmic flash of beacons announced the approach of a vessel, larger, swifter, steady in its course, the Coast Guard. Relief spread through the crew like a tide, their shoulders easing as they caught sight of the cutters slicing through the waves. The nightmare was nearly over. When the Coast Guard boarded, the contrast was stark. Officers in crisp uniforms spread across the decks with efficient precision, their voices clipped, their movements confident. They took custody of the pirates, securing them with practiced ease, documenting every weapon, every scrap of evidence, every damaged section of the yacht. The pirate leader spat curses as he was dragged past Richard, but the captain did not respond, merely watching with steady eyes as order returned in measured steps. The chaos that had consumed the vessel was being replaced by structure, by authority. Passengers gathered on the deck, watching the process unfold. They clung together, whispering their relief, their gratitude, though many glanced uneasily at Richard and his crew. It was not simply gratitude they felt, it was also the sting of recognition, the realization that the men they had belittled had proven their worth beyond measure. Money had not saved them, status had not shielded them. It had been discipline, skill, and courage. When an officer of the Coast Guard approached Richard to take his statement, the crew gathered silently behind their captain, a wall of quiet solidarity. Richard spoke plainly, recounting the events with accuracy and restraint, giving credit to the men who had executed his orders, mentioning by name those who had risked themselves to hold the pirates at bay. He did not embellish, nor did he downplay. He reported as a sailor would, a record of action, nothing more. The officer nodded, scribbling notes, his expression respectful. As the questioning ended, the passengers approached once more. Ethan stepped forward, his face still pale, his voice softer now. "Captain," he began haltingly, "I misjudged you. We all did. You were the only one who kept your head when the rest of us lost ours. I can't." He faltered, glancing at Clara, then back to Richard. "I can't thank you enough." Clara, her voice trembling, added, "We would not be here if not for you." Richard looked at them for a long moment, his dark eyes reflecting the faint glow of the Coast Guard lights. He gave a single nod, but said nothing further. There was no need. The sea had already taught its lesson, and he was not the kind of man to twist the knife of shame into those who had survived. It was enough that they now understood. As the Coast Guard completed their work and the pirates were led away in shackles, calm returned to the Orlux. The crew began to restore what could be salvaged, righting chairs, sweeping broken glass, mending what was within their power. The passengers withdrew into the quieter corners of the yacht, speaking in hushed tones, their laughter gone, their voices heavy with reflection. On the upper deck, Richard stood alone, gazing out over the horizon. The stars stretched endlessly above him, cold and eternal, while the sea below gleamed faintly under their light. He breathed deeply of the night air, letting it fill him with the quiet certainty he had always found on the water. The battle was done. The storm endured. His men were alive, his passengers safe. That was enough. For Richard, there was no triumph to savor, no pride to parade. What he had done tonight was what he had always done. His duty, nothing more, nothing less. He thought of home, of the children he would one day see again, of the peace that awaited him beyond the horizon. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the cool breeze wash over him, and when he opened them again, the sea lay calm, its surface smooth and unbroken, as though it had never borne witness to the violence of the night. Behind him, laughter would one day return to the salons. Champagne would flow once more, and the arrogance of wealth might resurface with time. But he knew that for this night at least, the passengers of the Orlux had glimpsed a truth they could never forget, that all their riches and pride were nothing against the power of the sea, and that salvation had come not from their own importance, but from the quiet strength of a man they had scorned. Richard remained at the rail, the weight of command finally lifting from his shoulders. The coast stretched far away in the darkness, but he felt its presence as surely as he felt the steady rhythm of the tide. His work was not yet done, but the worst had passed. The ship still stood, the people still breathed, and the sea, indifferent as ever, rolled on. And so, beneath the infinite canopy of stars, Captain Richard allowed himself a long, steady breath, the kind a man takes only when he knows he has carried his burden to its end. The storm had broken, the night was calm again, and in the silence of the waves, he found the peace he had earned. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe right now so you don't miss the next shocking twist coming your way. Want more? Click on one of these videos on your screen. Each one hides a story even more unbelievable than this, and don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with your friends so they can experience it too.